We are so delighted to have you back with us again here at the Lubar Center, Marquette University Law School, Eckstein Hall. I'm Mike Goucher, and this is On the Issues. It's our continuing series of conversations with news and policymakers, people we often say are doing interesting, important work in this region and beyond. And that certainly applies to our next guest, Ayad Akhtar. Mr. Akhtar is a novelist. He was the author of the book American Dervish, which was published in more than 20 languages around the world. He's a screenwriter. He's an actor, although he'd like a couple more roles, I understand. But he's probably best known to all of us in this room as one of America's leading playwrights. Back in 2013, he won the Pulitzer Prize for drama for the production of the play Disgraced. And his play Junk is currently being performed by the Milwaukee Repertory Theater. Junk, as in Junk Bonds, is a story set in the mid-'80s, but a story about the impact of money on American culture today. We're going to be talking about that. I do want to say that I saw the play on Tuesday night. Officially opens to everyone, I think, tonight. But I saw the play on Tuesday night, and I highly recommend it. It really is a tale of not just that time, but our times. So having said that, won't you please welcome our guest, Ayad Akhtar from the Marquette Law School. I want to say welcome home because some people in this room may know this, but some people do not. You spent a lot of your formative years here in the Milwaukee area.
Yeah, I grew up here. First, we moved to Brown Deer area. I think it was 5, and then my dad's down in the front row here. We were in New York, and he got an offer to start a cardiology lab at the University of Wisconsin, carte blanche, basically start his own lab. And he moved us out to Wisconsin. I don't think he knew what Wisconsin was, and I'm not sure my mom ever forgave him for bringing him. We came to love this community tremendously. I mean, I grew up here, so Brookfield and Elm Grove. Ultimately, I went to Brookfield Central, and then left to go out east to go to school. But have retained a connection to this community. My brother and my dad both still live here, so I love coming back, and I have an ongoing artistic relationship with the rep.
Yeah.
So.
Your mom and dad were doctors.
Yeah.
Were they okay with your chosen occupation? They're okay with that now? It's all good now?
I think you should probably ask him, I think we probably have differing recollections of exactly how it all went down.
How do you recall it going down?
Very supportive, though perplexed and confused about, how was I ever going to make a living, and how long was this going to go on, and I think believed in me a lot because he once said to me, "You should have become a lawyer. You can talk the monkeys out of the trees." But why am I languishing for so long in this? And it's hard because that's the process of assimilation in a way. It's I didn't come into the business, into show business with a family that understood what that was, and didn't. My family came over from Pakistan. My folks are both in their mid-20s when they came here, and there's so many things about this culture they learned through me, and then later through my brother. So it was a kind of dual assimilation, and in order to tell stories in an American idiom, you have to kind of integrate. There's a different level of integration that you have to sort of understand the genres, the way jokes are told, and all sorts of stuff. So it took a while. My dad always says that he was a late bloomer too, and that we're all late bloomers. So maybe that was part of it.
So how much of your life here in the Midwest is reflected in your work? Obviously, a fair amount.
I think so. I think there's an earnestness about my work and a desire to sort of connect to the audience, not through cynicism or irony, but through kind of direct and sincere, almost literalness that I think is about being from the Midwest. I have a fiance now, and she's from out east, and she came to Milwaukee for the first time. And even in this era, and I feel like we're not living in the same state that I grew up in terms of civility. I've had experiences in the past couple of years that I would never have imagined could have happened in Wisconsin. But even now, she was totally shocked. She's like, everybody's so nice. They always asking me how I'm doing, and they seem like they really mean it. And I was like, yeah, that's where I grew up, And so it's different than New York. I mean, I've been in New York for 25 years now. That cynicism and irony is, appealing, but it's not something that I share, really.
You tell a funny story when you moved to New York, and this will relate to what we're about to discuss here.
Yeah.
Your interest in finance. You've been a longtime reader of the Wall Street Journal.
Because of my dad, yeah.
Really? He encouraged you?
Yes, he did. Yeah. You know, I think my mom and my dad were both very concerned about how I was going to make a living. You know, I tell the joke. It's very awkward now to have to say this in front of my father because I usually do it with his accent. And, but
I'm sorry.
But yeah, you know, they were worried about how I was going to make a living. I was reading all this poetry and what is the kid going to do with his life? You know? So encouraged me to read the Wall Street Journal every day and would send me a little cash, agreed to sort of pay my rent, if you will. And for 2 years, I read the Wall Street Journal every day. I would walk up 3rd Avenue to 28th Street and sit in the library and read it. And I got interested in finance. I say this about you a lot. I don't know if it's true that I think he thought that if he could get me reading about something, it would get me interested. It's actually what happened, you know. So I got interested in finance, and I think the thing that I started to understand was that the world, the way that decisions were made in the world, it was better explained in a way through understanding how money flowed and why people made decisions about the money that they had affected the world in a larger sense. So it opened up a perspective on reality and on on our society that was something it was foreign to me before then.
Yeah, I heard an interview I think you did with Bill Moyers a couple of years ago, and you were talking about your interest in finance, and you said, I think to understand how, and I'm paraphrasing here, correct me if I'm wrong, but something along the lines to understand how the world is put together today, you have to have a deep understanding of finance.
I think so.
You do?
I do. I think that, you know, property has its own perspective. And when you have enough of it, you start to see the world through that perspective. And the acquisition of property, and more importantly, the maintenance of property, I think that, you know, one of the first principles of capitalism, of contemporary capitalism, is money must grow, right? So that dictates so much of the world's activities, is the attempt to find parking places to put money so that it can grow. And the extent to which that affects decision-making and has affected the creation of the society that we live in, I think people underestimate. You know, one of the things that I often say about that is that capitalism, contemporary, and I don't mean any of this in a judgmental way, I'm not a closet Marxist, but I do tend to think about these things a lot, and I have criticisms about them, about contemporary capitalism. I think fundamentally, to me, contemporary capitalism is predicated on a contradiction, which is that the abstraction of capital is never allowed to return to the cycle of decay. There is no winter or fall in the life of capital. There is only spring and summer. And so in a way, this notion that money must always grow is at odds with reality, and it accounts for some of the contradictions that we have to deal with, whether they're financial crises or the kinds of wealth inequality, the gaps of wealth inequality that are increasingly stark that we're dealing with. Free markets don't take care of themselves, actually. And I don't think the Enlightenment philosophers believed that either. So anyway.
So let's talk about the play that you wrote. It's called Junk, I said earlier, as in junk bonds, set in the mid-'80s. Give us a brief description of what the play is about, and then we'll show a clip to give you a sense of what's being discussed in this.
I take a leverage buyout that turns into a hostile takeover, and I put that deal on stage, every part of that deal: accountants, lawyers, arbitrage guys, management, legal for management, corporate raiders, legal for corporate raiders, law enforcement. We watch the deal play out in mostly real time. We begin at the beginning of the deal, we end at the end of the end and the aftermath of the deal. And over the course of that experience of watching business play out as this steel company, a Bethlehem Steel, if you will, gets taken over by a group of young financiers, we watch two modes of business being played out. And one is a sort of paternalistic, ethno-homogenous, older guard, WASP-oriented capitalism that is more sensitive to its effects on locality than the younger, more diverse, meritocratic, capitalists, the younger generation, who are really espousing a kind of individualism that was, I think, then new to America in the 80s. And we watched that battle play out over the course of the play.
It's a remarkable 2 hours. I'm going to show the clip right now, and then we'll talk about it on the other side. So Ryan, if you want to take us to the video, and you can watch it on these big screens on either side of the room. And hopefully the audio will be good for you too.
Coming soon. Best perform.
This is the story of kings, or what passes for kings these days. Kingsmen, bedecked in Brooks Brothers and Brioni, enthroned in sky-high castles, and embroiled in battles over, what else? Money. The mid-80s, 1985 to be exact. 85 is when I started to sense something new. The rollick, the rage, the ravenous zeal in people's eyes. It was like a new religion. It was being born.
So I am struck by that last line, how money became the only thing that mattered. And actually, Judy Chen, the character who we saw in that clip, comes out and says that at the beginning of the play. When did money become a thing? When did it become the only thing? And you're saying the mid-'80s. There was
I think
a
so.
change.
Yeah, I think so. I think that there's a lot of ways to slice this question, but one way that I tend to do it is I tend to say that I think there was the 80s, we saw the end of a kind of age of fracture, of a kind of collective American identity. Maybe an identity that was problematic in some ways, but that was fractured by, the political upheavals of the civil rights movement and the death of JFK, the loss of morale because of the Vietnam War, and then ultimately I think the disillusionment in our symbolic king and the political process in Richard Nixon. And I think that what ended up happening is that on the other side of this kind of upheaval, that also had underpinning it the crumbling of the economic stability that the United States was and still is in some ways, but certainly post-war until about 1972, was at the center of the world economy because we were guaranteeing the price of gold, the Bretton Woods system. So the entire world had to come to the United States for their money. And I think that alongside that's really the secret history of the post-war boom and the sort of extraordinary generation of wealth that it created, that began to end in the early 70s. And what ended up happening on the other side of that was the resurgence or a birth of a different notion of what it meant to be American, I think, which is kind of rampant individualism. And that rampant...
Collective we took a back seat to individualism.
To individualism, and I think that's really at the heart of the sort of Reagan Revolution in many ways. And that was not just ideological or philosophical, it was also regulatory. It was also... It was underpinned by a different kind of economic approach to stuff. And I think that we are now living in a world where, I think another wonky way of talking about this is to say political legitimacy has always been tied to 2+% growth. After 72, 2+% growth was problematic. The only way to justify 2+% growth was debt. And the rise of debt in the Reagan era is not a coincidence because it was the only way to justify being in power and to have the reins of power was to find a way to have 2+% growth. So what you saw in the 80s was a kind of rise of an individualist economic ethic and a way of approaching money and value that became increasingly abstract. We didn't have fixed income departments in investment banks really in any significant way until 1983, 84, and then the late 80s. Now fixed income departments in investment banks out-earn the rest of the bank 20 to 1, 50 to 1. They're the biggest. Now, what is fixed income? For those of you who don't know what fixed income is, fixed income departments are basically departments at a bank that figure out how to take a fixed income payment on your credit card, on your car loan, on your home mortgage, on a corporate loan, corporate bond, to turn that fixed income payment, that $1,000 a month you pay, into an income stream that has multiple revenue streams. So you're selling debt, you're creating debt, you're selling debt. The CEO of GM says, I don't want to make cars, I want to make money. And what he means by that is they make more money financing the cars that they lend you money to buy their cars. They don't make as much money on the cars. They make money on the loans that they make you. And that's a metaphor for the larger sort of American economy. It's a metaphor for the larger world economy in a way, which has really become about leverage. I don't think we live in an era of capitalism per se. I think we live in an era of leverage and debt, which is, I don't think capital, strictly speaking, we're not living in an era of capital, if you will.
So back in the mid-'80s,
yeah, I drifted. I'm sorry. You asked me a question. I just went off.
Debt becomes an asset. And the lead character in the play Junk is a guy by the name of Bob Merkin, who is modeled, well, let's say it's fairly close to Michael Merkin,
yeah, totally.
the junk bond king who was sent to prison. And
which is, of course, not his real legacy.
yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
It's true.
His real legacy is to have figured out a way after Paul Volcker dropped interest rates, again, letting them rise to 20%. As some of you will remember, you could have made 20% in a savings account at one point. Mm-hmm. When that dropped again, he had created an appetite for yield worldwide. People wanted those 20% returns. And the sort of corporate debt market suddenly took on fire, and that's where you began to have fixed income departments across. And that innovation of how to monetize debt, how to create subsidiary streams of revenue off of debt, that's the innovation that I think really Milken he's a central figure in American history for that reason.
So Bob Merkin looks a little bit like Michael Milken in this play. And he, in the clip that we're going to look at, is trying to explain to the potential buyer of Everson Steel how this works. And this is what I love, because it is, to the average person, not easy to understand, or even to the guy who wants to buy the company, not easy to understand. So Ryan, go ahead and let her rip.
Amy and I went through Everson's numbers last night.
His wife's a genius with spreadsheets.
Wait, you guys got Everson numbers?
Detailed statements, line items from every division.
You got inside numbers, how?
Someone I know.
From where?
What do you care?
It turns out the pharmaceutical divisions they bought 10 years ago were throwing off serious cash. Okay. That cash flow can be used as collateral on a loan for the rest of the money.
We're going to take out a loan against Everson Steel?
Yes.
But I don't own it yet.
Doesn't matter.
Who came up with this?
I didn't.
They didn't just put him on the cover of Time magazine for nothing.
I didn't want to be on the cover of Time magazine.
You came off great, bringing America back.
They called me a job killer.
They also called you America's alchemist, turning debt into cash from something, nothing.
I'm not killing jobs. I'm creating them. The press is always looking for the simple story. The good guy, the bad guy. They don't do their homework. They don't understand how the real world works.
I say, when we win, when I own Everson Steel, I'm changing the name.
Yeah, I mean, that's a leveraged, debt financing 101.
Is that designed to have people's eyes glaze over when they hear that? Was that part of why it became, no, seriously, seriously, is that why that became so successful? Because many people did not fully grasp what was happening?
Well, I mean, it's classic negotiation. It's, fatigue the other party, right? Through the fine print. Who's going to read the fine print? I mean, these days, nobody reads the fine print. I mean, people who are selling mortgage debt don't read the fine print. People who are buying it don't read the fine print. So you can pass off a lot of stuff. It's a principle. I mean, I think, you can do a lot if you just fatigue. I mean, we see it politically happening every day. I mean, look at these new thresholds that are being crossed, because we just get tired. make fools out of people and take their money. A fool and his money are soon parted, right? Isn't that the sentence? So yeah, I think it's by design to some extent. But I mean, look at Goldman. They're selling securities, and then they're shorting their own securities. The clients don't know it. Clients sue. Judges go through the fine print, and they're like, "Well, it's in the fine print."
This reminds, I'm sure,
You allocated $1 billion. You didn't read the fine print?
No, I'm sure when some people watch the play or look at this, though, they think about what happened with mortgages and how the bottom fell out. We had the meltdown in the mortgage industry because people were not clear on how these investments were being done or even the risk associated with them. Junk bonds, yeah, that doesn't sound like it's a great product, but it doesn't say, junk bonds with a blaring light, look out ahead,
I mean, by the way, I'm not a bleeding heart liberal, but I'm going to mention Obama. So I was with somebody who was in the Obama administration, David Rhodes, not so long ago. No, Ben Rhodes. David Rhodes is the Wisconsin novelist. And he was telling me that from his perspective, he feels like the real crisis in Washington is that people don't know how to write legislation anymore, right? And as he was describing this, the breakdown of the communication of how to write legislation from one generation to the other, from people in one party who have that knowledge to the other, and that the recent tax bill that they passed, nobody actually knew what was in the tax bill. So we were going to find out, at tax time. People are still trying to figure it out. And I said to him, it's very funny that you should say that because my conclusion about the mortgage crisis after having studied, spent so much time thinking about finance and all of this sort of stuff, is that really what you've seen is a breakdown in knowing how to make loans. People just don't know how to do it anymore. And there seems to be this kind of breakdown of knowledge, which I think in some ways is connected to the way that we're farming out so much of our cognition to these devices. There's so many things that we're not actually spending the time to think about. We assume that the algorithm, which is going to answer the question for us with a device, is going to suffice. But there's a breakdown in human knowledge, legislation, making loans, all of that sort of stuff. And at the core, that's really the crisis that I think we're all dealing with. It's not a coincidence that Stephen's Point is going to be losing the history department. These things are all connected, You just have to zoom out wide enough to begin to see what the picture really is.
Talk a little bit about what you see in that character, Bob Merkin, the ego, because if you go to the play, one of the things that he says, Bob Merkin, the corporate raider, says in the play that he talks about how his, I lost my train of thought there.
Making the world?
Making the world. That
Right.
was the quote. Making the world. That's what he was doing, or how he saw what he was doing.
Well, that's certainly how Mike Milken saw it, and Mike Milken did make our world. It's interesting because writing about people who have these extraordinary ambitions, whether it's people that in our generation, the Zuckerbergs and the Michael Milkens, or we go back into history and the Augustuses and all of that, morality it's not really the question. It's not about morality. I think Dostoevsky in Crime and Punishment says that, 1 in a million, a man, I think he's, obviously not gender, it's at different times, he's using the wrong gender, but 1 in a million, a man will be born who is free enough to change the way that we think about what is good and what is evil. And so you have people like this who come along and they do things that are totally unacceptable on any kind of acceptable moral level if we think about it, but in fact they completely change the way that we're living. We may despise the innovations of all of these technology. In some ways we recognize the way that they are predatory and how they are sort of undermining so much of our lives, but by the same token, our lives are fundamentally changed because of them. And I don't think we're going back. Same with debt. There's no difference.
I want to show the audience one more clip before we continue our conversation. And again, we're talking about what was happening in the mid-'80s and how there was a challenge to the way business had always been done. And we're going to see a scene, Ryan, that features the journalist, Judy Chen, and Leo Tressler, who's a very successful business guy in his own right, who's bought and sold a few companies in his time, but he doesn't like the way the new breed of financier is behaving.
Right.
So let's take a look at that. Very interesting conversation they have.
Robert Merkin is a
assets. Then he gives that money to some two-bit nobody to buy the company. But once they own it, that company is weighed down with debt and can't pay back, which becomes the excuse for Merkin and his cronies to go in, chop it up, sell it all. He works every side of the deal. He makes fees raising the money, makes fees lending it, makes money off the purchase, off the sale. They can't print the bills fast enough for this guy. It's a racket.
Okay,
What, you don't agree?
you're a businessman, Mr. Kessler. I'm more interested in what you think Market is doing.
What he's doing? Yeah, what is he doing? We used to be a country that paid our bills, that made things. This guy comes along and says he's manufacturing debt. The only thing he's manufacturing is deals that do not need to happen. Deals that are excuses for his thievery. The bastard should be arrested, not put on the cover of Time magazine.
There's a lot of very intelligent people who don't agree with you.
Sheep being led to slaughter.
Hasn't American business gotten lazy? This generation of CEOs who inherited profitable companies, happy to live like little princes, golfing at their country clubs, sailing about on their company yachts. Aren't they the pretenders, Mr. Kessler?
Where are you from?
San Francisco?
No, I mean, well, you know what I mean.
Do I?
You know, your parents.
San Francisco, born and raised.
Okay.
My great-grandparents were born in China.
Right. So what did they do?
Well, my great-grandfather came over and worked on the railroad, actually.
Hard-working people. The kind who didn't take a thing for granted. Who saw the big picture and worked toward it. Not all this. Fake it till you make it.
Decidedly not.
Because if that's what you're doing, faking it till you make it, all you know how to do once you do make it is fake it.
Why is he so bothered by what they're doing? He's a very wealthy guy in this play. Why is he so bothered that other people are becoming wealthy?
Well, at the heart of the play is also a battle between two generations. And this is true to the era, the history of that era, is that the innovations, the debt innovations in the 80s on Wall Street were mostly instituted and sort of imagined by a group of younger Jewish financiers. And the mergers and acquisitions trade, if you will, was considered gauche for white shoe, blue blood, WASP firms. And lawyers in those firms didn't know how to do those deals. And Jewish lawyers from the previous generation couldn't get jobs at those firms. So they started their own outfits, which specialized in mergers and acquisitions. And so in the 70s, at the very beginning of the mergers and acquisitions craze, the only people who knew how to do those deals were Jewish lawyers. And the two people at the center of that history are Bruce Wasserstein at First Boston and Michael Milken at Drexel Burnham, both Jewish, financiers and lawyers. He is a old guard WASP, Teddy Forrestman meets T. Boone Pickens meets Ross Perot, right? And he's got a thing for these outsiders who've come along and they think that opportunity means elbowing your way to the front of the line and figuring out how to make it for your corner, your little corner of the world, your special tribe. He's only thinking about America. They're thinking about some other place. China, Cuba, there's some Cubans in the play and Chinese and these Jewish guys who says they're thinking about Israel. They're not thinking about this country. So there's an identity battle at the heart of the play, which is also a generational battle, which is also a battle between two visions of capitalism. Because we now live in an era where capital is the great equalizer in American life. I think there's nothing that makes you American like being rich. That's what makes you equal in this country. As 50 Cent says, get rich or die trying, right? Mm-hmm. And people who espouse generations who have espoused that path to equality or full franchise, full participation in American life have done so perhaps to some extent, he's suggesting, at the expense of a collective. So that battle between the collective and the individual, between the immigrant and the one who believes he is from here, that's at the heart of the play as well.
So I had an observation as I was watching it, and I'd be interested to see how you feel about this. So one of my takeaways was that almost every single character in the play ended up doing something they probably wouldn't have done or shouldn't have done because of money. Whether it was the journalist, whether it was the U.S. attorney, whether it was the corporate raiders and their aides, whether it was the investors who had some reservations about investing, everything was okay if people got paid, if people made
Ultimately,
money.
yeah.
Is
There's a line in the play, there's more disgrace in going broke in this nation than going to jail.
Do you believe that?
Of course. I don't think there's any question. I mean, I don't think that one wouldn't want to have to go to jail, of course. But I think that, you don't exist in this, we don't, meaningful participation in the political process, I mean, even from a political point of view, is writing a check. I mean, that's the vote, we don't even know to what extent the vote even counts, whether it's compromised because of gerrymandered districts or voter suppression or, the interference of some unnamed foreign country. And that's just talking about it. Now, I think that, and again, I don't mean this as a criticism, I just mean it as a statement of fact. We live in a kind of neo-feudal, limited representational democracy where those who have capital have meaningful participation in the political process, very much like the way that the landed gentry from 150 years ago, having a vote, had participation in the political process. That's the kind of democracy that we live in. And I think that in order to, I said this at the Bonnie North interview that I did a couple days ago, you want to change the world, go make $40 billion and tie up the NRA in litigation. That's how you change things in this country. And I don't see that as a cynical perspective. It may be unfortunate, but I do see it as a reality.
Do you think that people...
And let me just say one other thing.
Yeah.
Michael Milken is a saint now. He is somebody who is at the center of cultural and philanthropic life in Los Angeles. And he is widely referred to as the real mayor of LA. You want to get something done, you go see Michael Milken. And that rehabilitation of his image as the leading philanthropist in America is because he went to jail with $2 billion.
I was struck by something in the play, and I'd like to get your reaction to it, because it feels like to me you're questioning how capitalism is working in our culture today. And I know you read the Wall Street Journal, we heard that earlier.
I've sort of stopped, though, because I feel like the writing has gotten really bad.
So let me ask you about a story that I read, and so it was written by Gerard Baker, who was a former editor of the Wall Street Journal, and it was trying to explain the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez phenomenon. And no matter how you feel about her, one way or the other, but what he said is she's touched on something that he feels is growing, and that is that younger people especially don't feel that this modern day capitalism works in the same way that...
Well, it doesn't. I mean, we again, but to me, again, the notion of, and excuse me for sort of drifting here, but we're not talking about a capitalist, we're talking about a society predicated on debt. And I don't mean the national debt. We are delivering younger generations into the workplace in a form of indentured servitude to a corporate state. Right? The rental retail model, where you don't buy an object anymore, now you rent it, because when they rent this to you, that's a fixed income payment, and that fixed income payment creates two income streams because they can sell that income payment, right? So we're living in a society where we don't have property more and more, because to have property is to participate in the big game. We are being rented property or lent property, and those who have are continuing to accumulate a return. And so we have trillions of dollars on the sidelines that are never going to come back into the system except in the form of loans. Never. They're never coming back. And so you see larger and larger piles of cash making more and more money. There's never been more money in the history of the world. Municipalities don't have it. half of this country can't cobble together $400 in a situation of an emergency, there's no money for anybody else. That's not changing. Is that capitalism? I don't know that that's capitalism, strictly speaking. I think that the younger and younger generations recognize increasingly that they are being preyed upon, because they are being preyed upon. And again, I don't say it as a value judgment. That's just a fact. Well, how we want to change it, what we want to do about it, what we think is the rightful vision of the society, those are open to discussion. And I don't know that those are questions beyond my pay grade. But the reality is, the Ocasio-Cortezes of the world are just responding, I think, in some cases perhaps naively, to what the situation really is.
Tell us about the timing of the play Junk. You wrote this after you won the Pulitzer Prize. And I think you've said in past interviews that you knew there was a moment there to decide sort of what was going to happen with your future, and you chose to write this.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, I think the way that I usually answer that is I say that when I had the good fortune of being awarded the Pulitzer, I realized immediately no good could come from this, because either I was going to believe that I deserved it and try and imagine I was a better writer than I really was and not stay connected to the things I needed to keep working on to get better, or I was going to not believe that I deserved it and I was going to start writing defensively and then therefore start writing, taking me off into a different path. So I was like, what's the way to get out of this psychological conundrum? And it was to take a big artistic risk. And I'd always wanted to write a big play about finance. And I thought, if I write a play that's got, minimum 17 actors that the theater has to hire with 48 scenes and, is mostly in a language that almost nobody can understand, that it might actually get produced. And just for this little brief window of my career.
Do it now.
Yeah, do it now, get it in. So I did, and worked really hard for 3 years. It was just a real labor of love, but also intense labor to sort of decoct, distill, simplify, clarify, and yet not reduce the complexity. Because that's the one thing that I hate about so many of the shows and stuff you see about Wall Street and all that. The simplicity comes at the expense of what's really, it doesn't resemble the reality of what it is. For example, in this play, you see Wall Street, Gordon Gekko. Gordon Gekko is the guy that is at the center of that. Well, the guy behind Gordon Gekko is actually the real prime mover in that story. So here, the guy at the center of the play is not the guy buying the company, it's the guy raising the money for the guy buying the company, because that's the real center of power. So it was just that one level of trying to stay truer to the actual reality of how these deals happen, which made it that much more difficult to sort of convey simply to an audience.
On Disgraced, I got to ask you, were you surprised at all at its success? Because it does something that most of us are afraid to do at any sort of party anymore, talk politics or religion.
Yeah.
That's what the play is about, politics and religion in many respects.
I grew up in a house where that's pretty much all anybody talks about.
Right,
Still all we talk about, yeah, right.
What did you think about, the critical reviews are great, but to see the way the audience responded.
Yeah, I think I knew I had written a play that would connect to an audience. I don't think I expected it to be a critical success.
Interesting. Why not?
Because, in part because I don't think the critics got it, actually. I think in a weird way, I've often joked that I think part of my success is attributable to the fact that I've been so, consistently misinterpreted. That if people understood what I was really doing, I might not be so successful.
I want to explore that now. You've opened that door.
We know? I'll give you a perfect example. The question I get more than any other when I go to Q&As after Disgraced is, mind you, this is an audience that has just seen the play, probably a couple minutes before. And then I step out on stage, and 7 times out of 10, the first question I get is, why is it called Disgraced? To which I respond with bemusement and a little bit of superciliousness. You just had a character on stage 7 minutes ago, down center, speak a monologue at the end of the play that used the word disgraced twice in it. And you're asking me why it's called Disgraced. You know what that tells me? That tells me you were not really listening to that character. You heard a character, a young Muslim man, boy, who was dressed in a way that looked threatening, who was angry, and who was saying, "Mah, mah, 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 mah." And you're not listening to what he's saying. Because he says very clearly, for 300 years they've been coming to our part of the world. God, I can't remember this. making us want to be like them, look like them, marry their women. They disgraced us. They disgraced us. And then they pretend they don't understand the rage we've got. Why are you asking me why the play is called Disgraced? So obviously his language doesn't mean in the same way that other characters' language means. And it's true, it doesn't. There still has not been a review of that play that takes that character seriously. Because that character is seen simply as a signifier to signify now this character is going to the dark side. No, this character is giving you a history lesson. This history lesson is at the core of why these events have happened in this room. But the fact that you cannot see his language as instructive for your perspective is the dilemma of the play. So I still deal with that. I mean, people ask me now, why are you writing about finance? As if Amir in Disgraced is a mergers and acquisitions lawyer whose bosses are Jewish. These are his bosses. I wrote another play called The Invisible Hand about trading and finance, but somehow, I don't begrudge it. You know, you gotta, if this is the path, then this is the path. I think I am defined by the fact that I am perceived as writing about those people. And if an audience are sold or marketed, come see this play about those people and you'll understand those people a little bit better. That's actually
a heavy load to carry if you're the guy who's going to...
I'm not doing that.
I know.
But that's, so then I run up against, you know, a lot of Muslim sort of folks in my family who come to, not these guys, but who come to my work and, you know, they say, well, why aren't you doing something? Really the stupid version of it is, why don't you, you're so talented, why don't you write something that makes people want to become Muslim? Or why are you making us look bad in front of white people? Right? Which is, again, not my goal either. Yeah, as Faulkner once said, literature worthy of the name has to deal with the question of evil. I'm just trying to write some literature, I guess. I don't know if I'm succeeding, but that's what I'm trying to do.
I do want to ask you a question about something I mentioned earlier, the notion of the relationship between non-Muslims and Muslims and the Western world, for a lack of a better way of putting it.
Yeah.
How has it changed since you were a kid growing up in Milwaukee? What is different? What is the same?
If I'm honest, what's changed is that Muslims are now a real threat they're perceived as a real threat to the non-Muslim white, mostly white world. When I was growing up, Muslims didn't really, like, what's a Muslim? Like, what's that? And where's Pakistan? Is that like near Jamaica, or is that? Oh, that's great. Do you like the Green Bay Packers? Great. I like the Green Bay Packers too, so we don't like Lynn Dickey, but we like the Packers. You know, now it's a sort of invisibility has become replaced by a visibility that is defined by a kind of threat, right? On the other side, I think that there is, you know, and this is where it gets me into trouble when I talk about this stuff and write about it. On the other side, there's an antagonism in the Muslim world toward the West, toward America. And, you know, the thing that has continuously perplexed me in the past years since 9/11 is the failure of our own understanding or trying to understand how it is that we experience something that we had some part in. It's confusing to me that we don't even seem to want to make some attempt to understand why something like that would happen to us. It's seen as some random evil occurrence, like an intergalactic black hole that has somehow opened up at the heart of the social body and swallowed 3,000 innocent Americans. And therefore, we can justify destroying the world, which is what we've done in the past 15 years. We can justify our own vengeful retaliation, unconscious, and losing history at Stephen's point is not disconnected from this. It's all of a piece. So, when I criticize my community, Muslim community, and it's not like I'm not criticizing my other community, but I'm seen by the non-Muslim community as criticizing my own kind, which they appear to like. And the non-Muslim, and the Muslim part of my audience is like, see, this is what they're doing with your work. We understand what you're doing, but they don't understand what you're doing. And now you're successful. And so you've sold us, you've thrown us under the bus, and now you're rich and famous. Well, I'm not rich, and I don't think I'm famous except maybe like in this room, right? And probably only for like half of it. So, it's complicated. Yeah, it's a burden, but it's not one that I chose. It's one that's come, and I'm still dealing with it, working through it. I mean, I'm almost done with a new book, which deals with a lot of this stuff.
I was going to ask you about your next project. You say deal with a lot of this stuff. That'll be the next book?
Yeah, I'm writing a book which is about the story of my parents' generation of immigrants and their kids, and what became of their lives in America, and what that says about what they thought America was and what it ended up being for them in a post-9/11, post-Trump era, as told by one of their kids, a writer, who has gotten into some trouble writing about them, and who is often misunderstood because of the things that he writes. So
the family is smiling.
yes, they are. Yeah. I think my dad's still gloating because I'm talking to Mike Goucher. So.
So one final question about Junk, which runs through the middle of February. I think it's February 15th, as Francis is around. I think it's the 15th. Why will this resonate with Milwaukee audiences? You know this community well. Mm-hmm. Why will this play speak to people who live here?
Well, I hope it will. I mean, I think that Milwaukee is a community that has seen the effects of the loss of manufacturing and the dimming of our commitment to the working class, the relocation of wealth to coastal spots, elsewhere, far-flung places. Walmart's move into communities, and 86 cents of every dollar that's spent in a Walmart leaves that community, and in the process kills all kinds of businesses. I spent a few days driving around the western part of the state a week and a half ago. Small towns, gorgeous. God, the driftless area is so staggeringly beautiful. And so much land, so many people, so many farms, so much poverty, so much disrepair, so much inability to even take care of their own houses. I mean, there's one town I saw, Viroqua, was the only place anybody was taking care of their homes anymore. They don't have the money, they don't have the time, they're exhausted. You see them on main streets that are mostly empty, and then you drive into Madison and there's all of this wealth. And you think, right, of course, if I was living out in the regions, I would say, F those urban people. Look at what they're taking. I mean, we have allowed, and this is a subject of a different conversation, the antitrust regulations in this country post-Bork and under Reagan. I mean, that's really the big story in a way. 7% market share was justifiable cause for antitrust intervention in 1966. 7%. 50% today is not justifiable cause. What has that meant? That has meant that places like New York and San Francisco and this little town in Arkansas could create these firms these corporations that redistributed our wealth, that took our wealth away. And in a way, the technology for all of that is really what the play is about. It's about how that mechanism of that, the non-local intellectual economy pulls apart the local physical economy. And I think that that's a story which can resonate in this community for obvious reasons, you know.
Let me take a couple questions from the audience before we wrap things up. If you're in the seating bowl, please press on that little black device there in front of you. Keep your finger down on that. We'll all be able to hear your question. If you're in the back, wait for Ryan, the gentleman with the microphone and the maroon shirt. I'll call it maroon, Ryan. And he'll come over and hold the mic for your question. Keep the questions brief, no speeches if possible, and we'll take a few of them before Ed has to hit the road. So any questions?
Gentleman over there.
Back there? Yeah, hang on one second. We'll get a microphone for you.
Thank you. Can you say a little bit about inflation?
What do you want me to say about it?
It's low.
What's it going to do to all these nice people?
What's inflation going to do to all these nice people? Are you asking me about the stock market? Because if you are, I'm happy to answer that question. You know, in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, as you well know, our central bank bought a lot of bonds to put money into the system. That money has gone into the market. And now that the Fed is trying to pull, it was $2.5 trillion that they put in, right? And now that they're trying to pull money out, they pulled out about $500 billion. And that $500 billion coming out is what is dropped the market, right? So they still got to pull another $2 trillion out. And the balance here is going to be, are they going to be able to do that in a way that doesn't freak out everybody and drop the market to about 16,000, which is probably where it should be. It should not be at 23, 24, let alone 27, right? There's no justifiable reason for that number. But as you well know, since you followed the market most of your life, the stock market never follows reason. So if that's what you're asking me, that's my answer. As far as inflation goes, look, inflation is what it is. It's, 1.25%, 1.5%, 2%, whatever it's going to be,
You take other questions, raise your hand if you have one. And if you don't, we'll continue on. Anybody?
Really? Okay.
Deb, go ahead. Yeah, there you go.
First of all, thank you so much for all of your wonderful plays and for being here today. We love your work. And the question is that, listening to everything you've said today, there's still a sense that you're shining a light on immorality and travesty, and appropriately so. And I am a capitalist, but I'm not liking the capitalism today. Okay. And so, interestingly, I wonder whether or not a playwright ever gets to a point of, and it might not be in the genre, in the venue, but of suggesting, or whether it occurs to you. In other words, we didn't have a solution post-2008. We didn't have anything that was really done to change things at Wall Street. We didn't have anything that's done to change shootings, economics, there's lots of things, right? So do you ever contemplate
A solution?
A solution in?
Mike and I were talking in his office. I said I try to talk about the economic picture in a nonpartisan way because I think that the fundamental insight, the problems that we're dealing with around capitalism, Henry Ford had the fundamental insight to me, and Henry Ford is, of course, no friend of the working man. If you can't pay your workers enough to buy the cars they're making, you have a long-term structural problem. We are 40 years into creating a long-term structural problem that I fear we're not going to solve anymore. That's what I worry about. What's the redress? This is where it becomes partisan. Because the redress can only be regulatory. It can only be regulatory, unfortunately. But if you're dealing with an ideology that has become second nature now in this country, mindlessly in most cases, not in all, but in most cases, and we can talk about the history of that if you want, where government is somehow a four-letter word, what are we going to do? If we can't agree on a vision of government that somehow represents the collective will, and that collective will is enforced through regulation and law, what are we living in? And what do people believe when they say, I don't need government, but they have property? I don't understand what that means. And I am not, again, a closet Marxist or bleeding heart liberal. I am just a rational human being. But it's no longer reason. And when an outgoing party makes it impossible for an incoming party to attend to the rule of law, what is that? What kind of a political system is that? To what extent are we even talking about government? Now we're just purely in the realm of ideology. And for folks to not think that it's no different than watching a show trial in Stalinist Russia where people stand up and clap about these things that people think are true, but they're not true to us. We can tell that they're not true. Well, there's people around the world looking at us and saying, they believe that stuff? It's the same situation. So I can't get into a solution without provoking the ire of an audience that is not on the same page of any first principle. I'm thinking about a place set in ancient Rome where maybe I could begin to, there's enough distance there that people are not going to be, but if you said it today, I mean, there's a great play about Goldwater. There's a great play about the rise of Goldwater. But how do you tell that story without people they don't want to see the thing, they see what they think, you know? It's problematic.
Let's take another question or two. Yes. Hi.
I think you maybe just answered what I was about to. This is fascinating, and I'm so interested in your insights into finance and almost philosophy. I feel like there's a nonfiction book in you.
Oh, wow.
But if you write that, will it turn off potential audience members for your plays that you don't want to take a side or another?
You know,
Don't you have people urge you to speak out more on politics?
I do, and I'm open to it. You know, I'm open to it, but I'm not going to go. I just have not found. I haven't found the organic way to sort of get out there and just be talking about this stuff. You know, it's like, I think in a lot of cases, this is a unique situation in a way. You are a captive audience. You can't leave. You can't turn me off, right?
And the doors are locked.
Yeah, you can't turn me off. You can't turn me off to wait for later, or you know, and it took some time for us to find a rhythm together, right? And we have to spend an hour in the room together to develop a common language to begin to see these things. There are certain inherent limitations to communicate. You know, my brother's a philosopher and a remarkable. I talk to sharpens my mind, and you know, I think one of the things we talk about a lot is that language, the oral tradition, the transmission of thought through the presence of language, the presence of the speaker with the presence of the audience, that's fundamental, that there's something about a good church sermon or a great monologue in a play that affects you differently than when you see it on a screen, right? So I think there's an inherent limitation, I think, to the way that whatever experience you're having, which thank you for sharing that, I'm not sure I know yet how to translate it into any other form that feels organic and right. These situations feel very natural, but does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
Anybody else? How about right there? And that'll be the final question. Yes, sir.
To your play, Junk, I understand that the production of it was about a fourth or a third less than the original. What was left out?
Well, the runtime in Lincoln Center was 2 hours and 6 minutes without the intermissions. And right now the runtime's about two hours without an intermission. So there's only about 6 minutes that have been left out. And it's really just, it's just detail. There's no big scenes that are left out. There's no essential through line or storyline or characters. Nothing really has been cut other than tops and tails, little bit of the guts in this area, that kind of thing. Mike endorsed the intermissionless version.
It's actually, I do, because it is a very fast-paced storytelling, and I think to have an intermission would somehow detract from the telling of the story.
It could.
But what do I know? Not much.
This gentleman had a, question. Yeah, absolutely.
One relevance, if any, was the fact that Michael Milliken is Jewish. You didn't mention the religion or ethnicity of any other groups. So why did you happen to mention that Michael Milliken and Jewish attorneys involved in mergers and acquisitions?
Let me start by saying I acknowledge your ire and your irritation, and what's that?
I am very angry.
Yes, I understand. I think it may be a misinterpretation or misunderstanding. You are looking at a Muslim writer, right? Wait. No. I'm going to answer your question. You're looking at a Muslim writer who has identified with Jewish writers his whole career, who learned how to write about the American experience from Philip Roth and Saul Bellow and Chaim Potok and Isaac Bashevis Singer, who has written about Muslim anti-heroes and been misunderstood, has written about Muslim anti-heroes who don't identify with their own tribe, but who are identified by others by that tribe, who found in Milken and a generation of younger Jewish financiers dealing with an absolutely identical dilemma of bringing innovation and being defined by outsiders as greedy because they were Jewish, when all they were doing was playing a game better than the WASPs who were defining them as greedy, better than the WASPs played it, which is at the heart of the play. So all of the outrage that you're feeling is in the play because it's right. There is, in that generation of American life, and still on Wall Street, there's a real ethnic tribalism. And I think that ethnic tribalism, you'll see, hopefully you'll go see the play, you won't be so upset with me that you'll go see it, and you'll see that struggle, being identified as an outsider, Norbert Elias, the great German sociologist, said something I think is very brilliant, which is the dominant majority tends to derive its self-image from the minority of its best. And it tends to see the marginalized minorities in the image of their worst, right? And that's the dilemma of being an outsider in American life. I think if you're Jewish today, my guess is we've been through a process of assimilation and now a question again about what it means to be American. And I thought, at least I did, that if you were Jewish and you were American, it wasn't something worth commenting on. But of course, now with the rise of anti-Semitism across the country, we know that that's not the case. So those underlying identity, religious identity, ethnic identity issues, they're stitched into the play because they're part of my own experience. And I'm seeing in those Jewish characters a kind of cipher or stand-in for my own experience.
Thank you for your question. I want to thank everybody who joined us for this conversation this afternoon. Thank you for your interest, for your attention, for your good questions. And next week we'll have a busy week here at the law school. We'll be talking to Anna Clark, who is the author of The Poison City, a story about Flint, Michigan. And we'll also be announcing the latest results of our Marquette Law School poll. There are still seats available for the poll results, which will be coming out on Thursday. So again, thank you very much, and thank you to our guest, Akhtar.